My friends, today I want to talk to you about a truth that runs deep in the pages of Scripture. A truth that may be difficult to understand when we are walking through it, but one that is essential in God's plan for our lives. That truth is this: God often uses seasons of isolation to prepare His people for His greatest blessings. Throughout the Bible and in our own lives, we see that God often calls His people into seasons of isolation, not as a punishment, but as a preparation. Many times we misinterpret isolation as abandonment, as though God has withdrawn His presence from us. However, when we look closely at the pattern of God's dealings with His people, we begin to see that isolation is often a divine tool used to shape, refine, and equip us for greater blessings that lie ahead. Consider this: when God has a great purpose for your life, He does not rush you into it unprepared. He takes time to mold you, to teach you, and to develop the character necessary to sustain the blessing He wants to give you. Isolation is one of the primary ways He accomplishes this. In solitude, the noise of the world fades, distractions are removed, and we are left with nothing but our faith and the presence of God. It is in these moments that He strengthens our spirit and deepens our reliance on Him. Think about the story of Joseph. As a young man, he had great dreams of leadership and influence. But before those dreams could be fulfilled, he had to go through a season of isolation. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and later thrown into prison for a crime he did not commit. It must have seemed to Joseph as though he had been completely forgotten. Yet, in that place of isolation, God was preparing him. He was learning patience, humility, and trust. He was being shaped into the man who would one day rise to become second in command over all of Egypt. Had Joseph not endured that season of isolation, he would not have been prepared to handle the responsibility that came with his blessing. The same can be said of Moses. Raised in the palace of Pharaoh, he was destined for leadership. Yet before he could lead the Israelites out of slavery, he was sent into the wilderness for 40 years. Why? Because God needed to prepare him. In the solitude of the desert, Moses learned to rely on God's voice rather than his own strength. By the time God called him at the burning bush, Moses had been refined, humbled, and made ready to carry out the monumental task before him. Even David, the man after God's own heart, experienced seasons of isolation. Anointed as king while still a shepherd boy, he spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves, and experiencing betrayal from those he trusted. Yet in that solitude, God was preparing him. David's time in isolation was not wasted. It was there that he developed the faith, resilience, and character needed to become one of Israel's greatest kings. And then we come to Jesus himself. Before beginning his public ministry, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness for 40 days. Alone, fasting, and facing the temptations of the enemy, Jesus experienced the kind of isolation that many of us fear. Yet this was not a time of abandonment. This was a time of strengthening. When he emerged from that season, he stepped fully into his purpose, teaching, healing, and bringing salvation to the world. What does this mean for us? It means that when we find ourselves in a place of solitude, when we feel as though we are walking through a wilderness with no clear direction, we must not despair. Instead, we must recognize that God is doing something within us. He is preparing us for something greater. He is refining our faith, deepening our trust, and strengthening our character so that when the time comes, we will be ready to walk in the fullness of His blessings. So, if you find yourself in a season of isolation today, do not lose heart. This is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of something greater. Trust in the process, for when the time is right, God will bring you into the blessing He has been preparing for you all along. Throughout Scripture, we see a consistent pattern. Before God elevates someone, he first brings them into a period of isolation. This is not because he has abandoned them, but because he is preparing them for something greater. Time and time again, God's chosen individuals have found themselves removed from the crowds, taken away from their comfort, and placed in situations where they have nothing but faith to hold on to. And in every instance, that isolation was not wasted. It was a divine setup for a future filled with purpose and blessing. Consider the life of Joseph. As a young man, he had prophetic dreams of leadership and influence, but instead of stepping immediately into his destiny, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and later imprisoned for years. From an outside perspective, it looked like Joseph's dreams were destroyed. But in reality, God was using that season to develop him. In Potiphar's house, he learned stewardship. In prison, he learned patience and faithfulness. By the time he was brought before Pharaoh, he had been shaped into the wise and discerning leader that Egypt needed. Had Joseph not endured isolation, he would not have been prepared for the responsibility of saving an entire nation from famine. Moses is another example. Raised as a prince of Egypt, he had every privilege at his disposal, yet before God could use him to lead his people out of bondage, Moses had to spend 40 years in the wilderness. Imagine that, 4 decades in isolation, tending sheep in a foreign land. But those years were not meaningless. They were a time of breaking and reshaping, a time where Moses learned humility, perseverance, and dependence on God. When the burning bush appeared, Moses was no longer the impulsive young man who had once tried to take matters into his own hands. He was a man prepared to follow God's calling. David, too, experienced the refining power of isolation. Anointed as king while still a shepherd, he did not ascend to the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years hiding in caves, fleeing from Saul, and enduring betrayals. It was in those lonely moments that David wrote some of his most powerful psalms, songs of trust, surrender, and deep faith. When the time finally came for him to reign, he was not just a warrior, he was a man after God's own heart. His time in isolation had shaped him into the leader that Israel needed. Even Jesus followed this pattern. Before launching into his ministry, he was led into the wilderness, fasting and facing the devil's temptations. That period of solitude was not a punishment, it was a preparation. When he returned, he walked in power, healing the sick, preaching the good news, and fulfilling his mission on earth. God's pattern has not changed. When he isolates you, he is preparing you. That season of solitude is not wasted. It is a time of refining, strengthening, and molding you into the person you need to be for the blessings and responsibilities ahead. Trust his process, for he is always working for your good. My friends, if there is one truth you must hold on to, it is this: God never wastes a season of isolation. What may feel like loneliness or delay is in reality his preparation for something greater. The lives of Joseph, Moses, David, and even Jesus himself prove that before God brings his greatest blessings, he first refines, strengthens, and equips his people in solitude. If you find yourself in a place where you feel forgotten, remember, God is not punishing you, he is preparing you. He is building your character, increasing your faith, and shaping you for the calling he has placed on your life. You are not alone. He is with you. So do not grow weary. Do not let discouragement take hold. Instead, trust the process, embrace the preparation, and hold on to the promise that when the time is right, God will bring you out of isolation and into the blessing he has been preparing for you all along. His timing is perfect. His plans are greater than you can imagine. And your season of isolation is only the beginning of something far greater than you could ever dream.